Shri Gurubhyo Namaha. Good evening to everyone. Not morning. Very warm welcome to all of you to yet another session of Weekend with Wisdom. Today we have a special guest, Shri Krishna Fani. I hope I am spelling it correctly. Krishna Fani K.C. Rajuji. He is a mechanical engineer graduate with professional qualifications in management and law, and he has more than 41 years of experience in industry and academia. Study and research in ancient Indian philosophical and spiritual literature is his passion, and he is a keen student of Vedanta, Theosophy, Sri Jiddu Krishnamurti's teachings, etc. Krishna Paniji is an invited speaker at various management and spiritual forums. Currently, he is program director at Ritambara Wellness Private Limited and an enabler for spiritual and transcendental dimensions of holistic well-being at Ritambara. He has been a student of Vedanta for a very long time, and using his long experience, his own journey and learnings, he will be presenting over the course of today and tomorrow a new perspective on Advaita Vedanta, a perspective that will be very useful to us, that will be very practically relevant to us today. Sir, I'm very happy to have you here, and thank you for agreeing to come on our platform. And it is our pleasure to have you here. Viewers, if you have any questions, please put it on Q&A box, and sir will take it up towards the end of the session. With this brief opening remarks, Krishna Paniji, I welcome you now to start your session.
Thank you so much, Nitin. Thank you for that introduction. Am I audible? Is it okay?
Yes, sir. You're audible.
Okay. I'll be sharing my PowerPoint presentation.
Yes.
Yeah. The title of my presentation is a new perspective on Advaita Vedanta. This will be a discussion over over 2 days, today and tomorrow, for 2 hours each. I would like to start with the invocation. Om Sahana Vavatu Sahanau Bhunaktu Sahaviryam Karavavahai Tejasvinavadhitamastu ma vidvishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om, may He protect us both together. May He nourish us both together. May we both work together with great vitality. May our study be full of vigor and enlightening. May we not have any ill will towards each other. Om, peace, peace, peace. Om, Shamno Mitrasham Varunaha, Shamno Bhavatvaryama, Shamna Indro Bruhaspadihi, Shamno Vishnu Rurukramaha, Namo Brahmane, Namaste Vayo, Tvameva Pratyaksham Brahmasi, Tvameva Pratyaksham Brahma Vadishyami, Rutam Vadishyami, Satyam Vadishyami, Tanmamavatu, Tadvaktaramavatu, Avatu Mam, Avatu Vaktaram. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om, may Mitra be propitious to us. May Varuna be propitious to us. May the Honorable Aryama be propitious to us. May Indra and Brihaspati be propitious to us. May Vishnu with long strides be propitious to us. Salutations to you, O Brahman. Salutations to you, O Vayu, the breath of Purusha. You indeed are the manifestation of Brahman. I proclaim you indeed as the manifestation of Brahman. I speak about the cosmic order. I speak about the absolute truth. May that protect me. May that protect the preceptor. Protect me. Protect the preceptor. Om, peace, peace, peace. These are the two invocatory Shanti mantras of the Krishna Yajurveda. And before I start my presentation, I would like to very briefly explain the basis of the presentation. At the very outset, I would like to mention that the subject for these two-day presentation is based on two approaches. Firstly, from my own understanding, based on the study of authentic literature available on Advaita Vedanta. Secondly, on my own intuitive appreciation at a deep and personal level, which is an outcome of contemplative and meditative ruminations. Though I have given the title as a new perspective, it is actually a set of perspectives which I'll be discussing. And this set of perspectives to be discussed may or may not fit into the strictly traditional interpretations and explanations proffered on this subject, which, at least to me, are merely a process of verbalizations of that which is beyond word and thought, as the Taittiriya Upanishad very clearly enunciates. Yato vacho nivartante aprapya manasasaha. So it's beyond mere verbalizations and mental activity to understand this. So as I said, the approach would be more from a personal understanding and an intuitive appreciation of the subject. After all, we are talking about an ultimate reality which is propounded in the Advaita Vedanta, which is something beyond the comprehension and beyond the reach of the ordinary level of consciousness, the mental consciousness level at which we normally function. I'm also, in this context, I'm also reminded of the statement of Lao Tse. And he says, the Tao, which can be named, is not the true Tao. And it is not an aspect of acceptance or denial, justifying or condemning or, proposing something for mere intellectual, entertainment. Because we are talking about a truth which, if it is true, it is always true. It is eternally true. And if it is not true, one cannot wish and bring it into existence and make it true. That is precisely what the Bhagavad Gita in the second chapter talks about. Nasato vidyate bhavo, na bhavo vidyate sataha. Of the non-existent, that is the asat, there is no coming to be. And of the existent, the sat, there is no ceasing to be. Our opinions and perspectives in the strictest sense do not really matter. And when I'm discussing this subject, I would also like to make a mention here right at the beginning as a caveat that I have no axe to grind. And I am not propounding anything new in the sense that that which is not there. I'm only bringing a new perspective and a new dimension to this ancient and eternal wisdom that is available to us. So my only intention is to trace a path to approach reality. So which it has been very categorically stated in the ancient literature that is available to us, that it is something beyond perception, beyond any transactional arrangement. It is beyond the grasping of the mind, beyond all attributes, beyond thinking and expression in any form whatsoever. So any debates and arguments on the words and their finer nuances are, as far as I am concerned, out of bounds for me, because I fully subscribe to the view expressed in the Narada Bhakti Sutras. Talking about Bhakti in the Sutras, there's a very interesting sutra which says Vado Navalambyaha. One cannot get into serious arguments or debates or disputations on some of these things which are by definition are eternal, by definition they are imperishable, and something beyond the reach of the level at which we normally discuss this, like ratiocination at the mental level, or coming to some kind of a decision based on very imperfect and what I would say as a limited perspective of things. So with these introductory remarks, I would like to proceed. And before I proceed, I would like to just give my understanding of the word perspective also. Perspective, the word has a Latin root meaning look through or perceive. It also means an outlook. The word perceive means to attain awareness or understanding or come to realize something. So with that understanding of this term perspective, I would like to start by sharing with you the different perspectives I have collected on Advaita Vedanta. The first perspective is that Advaita is not a Siddhanta or a Vada. Siddhanta, by definition, means a demonstrated conclusion of an argument. And though Vada also has a similar meaning, it also has the added connotation of a proposition or a doctrine as such. So at the very beginning, my perspective of Advaita is that it cannot be viewed as a demonstrated conclusion of an argument or a thesis or a particular school of thought. And it is not something for mere scoring a point or showing off our scholarship or intellectual understanding or our ability to get into a kind of logic which doesn't apply at the level at which this truth is being talked about. Similarly, therefore, I have mentioned that it is not a discursive or a polemic refutation of somebody else's thesis. There's no element of refuting somebody else's thesis or what one would call as a Siddhanta. So none of these things apply when I'm talking about Advaita. And according to me, it is a transcendent truth. It is something which is true intrinsically and inherently. And it doesn't need any external evidentiary support to establish the fact that it is true. And when I say transcendent, I'll come to that word in explaining it in much more detail. It means that we are transcending the normal level of consciousness at which we function and go into a dimension where none of these things really matter or apply in any manner. Whatever we know, whatever is our experience, whatever is our understanding of things, they have no relevance at that level. And that is what I'm calling it as the transcendent. And why I am saying this, I'm going to take up in the second perspective that I'm going to talk about. The second perspective is from a scientific point of view. I would like to draw your attention to this trinity. This is a wonderful trinity in mathematics where they talk about 0, 1, and infinity. This is a very insightful trinity which one needs to understand. And as it is said, it is from the Eastern and the Indic civilization and culture that the very concept of 0 has evolved. It might have evolved thousands and thousands of years ago as a consequence of the intellectual understanding of life and nature, and by the very basis at which the whole system is viewed. So I'm going to dwell upon these three terms. And the starting point of manifestation of the ultimate reality is unity, or non-duality, to be more precise. You know, we are talking about unity as the basis of all manifestation of that ultimate reality, which subsequently I'm naming it as, we're giving it the familiar name of Brahman. The traditional or conventional science which we study inherently or implicitly takes 0 as the datum or the base. But there is an essential difference from the Eastern perspective, and also the very basis of understanding of things. Because according to the Eastern or the Indic viewpoint, it is unity or one, which is, to make it much more clear, they have also used the term non-duality. That means there cannot be a second to it. There cannot be anything which occupies a place second to this unity. So this unity is something unique and self-sustaining and does not need anything else to be added to it. And to impress upon this, the Upanishads have used the term Ekameva Advitiyam. They did not simply stop at Ekam. They also very clearly mentioned Advitiyam. That means it is both one and that there is no second. The emphasis is on Advitiyam. Because strictly speaking, when there is what you call as something singular and something unique, you can't really call or name it as one. Because our understanding would lead to thinking that if you're saying one, it should either be succeeded by something or preceded by something. But that also does not apply here. It is just there. And it is the only thing that is there, if I may strictly call it as a thing. It's not even a thing, but unfortunately, because we use words, sometimes we may have to resort to these terms. So I would like you to intuitively understand that we are talking about something which by definition cannot have a second. And the symbol, the expression, and the abstraction of this particular singularity, which doesn't have a second, is given the name Brahman. Brahman is only a symbolic word. It signifies something which is not readily accessible to us with the available instruments and faculties which we have. So we are talking about that entity which is symbolically represented by the word Brahman, and therefore I called it as a symbol and an expression and an abstraction of the unity and the non-duality which we are talking about. And it is from this the term Advaita is drawn. From the Upanishads, when they said Ekameva Advitiyam, it is from this Advitiyam the term Advaita is drawn, and a whole system of explaining to the maximum extent possible verbally has been presented. But all the verbal explanation cannot really be taken to be true or really representing truth. It is only an indicator. It is only a pointer towards that unity or non-duality and that ultimate reality, which we are calling it as the Brahman, which is again a symbol. So the whole system of Advaita is an elaboration to indicate, to point towards something which is to be realized intuitively without the interference of any of the faculties with which we are familiar with. No instrument, whether the senses or the mind or anything beyond the mind also, are not the right instruments and right faculties to come about and realize what it truly is. In fact, the existing faculties and existing instruments are considered to be the biggest barriers in understanding this truth. So as it is put in a very beautiful way, what we consider as the self is the biggest challenge which we have to overcome, because it is said to be a falsely created entity which becomes a great hurdle. So as somebody has beautifully put it, liberation is not of the self, but liberation from the self, because the self is the hurdle. Self is the obstructing agent in realizing that unity or that non-duality which we are talking about. So one has to go beyond this to understand the true nature of what exactly Advitiya means. And in that context, as I have pointed out, the starting point or the basis or ground for all manifestation of that principle, which we are calling it as the ultimate reality or the Brahman, the ground is 1 and not 0. Why is it 1 and not 0? Because if you see, 0 is primarily a derivative of this unity, or what we call as 1. Logically speaking, it is reasonable to say that unless there is something, again I have put thing in quotes to just say that I'm talking about an entity, not exactly something physical or even conceptual, but I'm talking about an entity. And unless there is some such entity, it cannot come into being or becoming. So both from the unmanifest and the manifest dimensions, the basis or the foundation is unity. Therefore, one is the substratum of everything. This entity that primordially exists, when I use the term primordially, I'm talking about something or the entity being there even before the emergence of space and time and causation, which are the dominant features of manifestation. So something that primordially exists cannot be or become non-existent. So this fundamental issue of zero being a derivative is brought about very beautifully in our ancient grammar itself. In the Panini Ashtadhyayi, there is a sutra, there is a formula called Adarshanam Lopaha. He defines the term Lopa or lack of something. And he uses the term Adarshanam. That means, what do you call as something lacking or absent? It is only valid provided it was there earlier. Something which was there earlier is not there now, is lopa or absence. That is precisely what zero denotes. Something was there earlier, it's no longer there. You very conveniently, we can take an example of something which we can consume or eat. Suppose there is a fruit and I consume it. So physically, what was present earlier is no longer present in the same form, and that absence of a thing which was present earlier is what is denoted by this term zero. So you see, you have a fruit and you have consumed the fruit. Therefore, it is like 1 minus 1, which is equivalent to 0. Now, 0 is an operator. 0, fundamentally speaking, has no physical validity. Can somebody show me 0? Can anybody demonstrate and say that this is 0? Because it has no physical validity. Like negative numbers also do not have a physical validity of their own. In our daily communication and transactions, do we at any time hear somebody asking, I can say, give me 1 fruit. But can somebody say, give me minus 1 fruit? So whether it is 0 or negative numbers, they either indicate a point or a direction or the absence of something which was there earlier. Like we have the convention of the number line. We have this convention of the number line where you identify an arbitrary point as a starting point and call that as 0 or origin, and any movement towards the right is a positive movement, and you denote equal intervals as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 on the right side of it, and similar equal intervals on the left side, you denote them as -1, -2, -3, and so on. It is only a matter of convention. All of us have accepted to say that I'll denote everything on the right side with a positive symbol and everything on the left side with a negative symbol. But look at it from the point of view of a physical validity. The physical validity of a negative number. It's only a point on the number line, including the zero, because we have arbitrarily identified a particular point and said that this is the starting point, and to denote that starting point, we have designated it as zero. But from a physical point of view, as I said, it indicates the absence of something which was there earlier. It was there earlier and it is not there now. It's as simple as that. So the why I am emphasizing on this is to bring home the point that zero cannot be the substratum. This is what was realized long back, and that is why they called it as Ekameva Dvitiyam. Whether we're talking about the unmanifest or the manifest, it is still unity which is there. And that fundamental unity, which we are calling it as one, or denoted by the term Ekam, and for the sake of emphasis, they have added this point of Advitiyam. There cannot be anything second to it. It does not brook another entity coming into being because of the other dimension which I am going to come to. And let me take you through a further understanding of this term. See, you need to understand that zero is not a number per se. It is only a symbol. It symbolizes that which is self-limiting, self-enclosing, bounded, and that which has no cognizable beginning or ending. You see the very figure zero, once you have drawn the figure zero, can we identify where is the beginning and where is the ending of it? It's circular. So when I'm talking about beginningless and endingless or unending, it does not mean something which is beyond my capability of understanding. We can very much understand that aspect of it, that concept of it, by looking at this figure called zero. Having drawn a zero or a circle, it has these three properties. One is it is self-limiting. It has delimited itself from everything else. And it's enclosed. Nothing from outside can come in, nothing from inside can go out. So it is self-enclosed. And there is a boundary. There is an outer boundary, a limit to it. A boundary is there. And the very figure also brings home the point that there is no beginning or ending to it. So we need to have this perspective on this term zero. And as I mentioned, zero is derived from one. The absence of something is zero. What was there earlier, if it is not there now, that is called as zero. A thing which was there earlier and not there now also denotes that it is impermanent. It is subject to change. So it cannot be something which is eternally existing. And precisely for this reason, Shunya or void has no place or basis in Advaita. There may be other schools of thought which have talked about Shunya or void. And according to me, it's only a misconception and a misnomer to classify something as Shunya or void, because that has no place or basis in Advaita. Because Advaita starts from unity. That is what is to be understood. So zero is a symbol of that which is there, which was there temporarily and now has vanished. It's only a mathematical operator. And it is quite similar to root of -1. If people are familiar with complex numbers, this is a complex number and this is also called as an imaginary number. You see, this number, root of -1, Another point to be understood very clearly about this root of -1 is it can never be identified on the number line. You can never pinpoint. There is no possibility of pinpointing root of -1 on the number line at all. It is something beyond the number line. Therefore, it is called as imaginary number. But very interestingly, it has usefulness and significance in this manifested world. For example, electricity, especially alternate current, AC, a sine or a cosine wave relies upon this imaginary number. There are so many other areas, there are so many other fields where this has a very important significance and a usefulness, where a lot of technology is built on the theory and the mathematical equations that are developed using root of -1. This is another indication to tell us that what is imaginary, what is not real in itself, can have significance in manifestation, which itself is imaginary according to Advaita. Imaginary in the sense, it has no permanence and it has the property of incessantly changing. We are not saying it's not real. For example, a mobile phone or a cellular phone, as we call it as, is a product which is manufactured whose mathematical basis is root of -1 or the imaginary number. Now you have got something tangible out of it, isn't it? You have used for your theory and development of technology. That means the science has been converted into technology for making something physical using an imaginary basis. So nobody can deny the usefulness of this imaginary number, similar to what we are saying about the usefulness of what we call as the manifested world. The manifested world has a usefulness of its own. So that is what is to be understood when we are talking about zero as a mathematical operator, which has no, what do you call as physical reality. So that's why, as I said, zero is also to be noted as an inflection point and is marked on the number line for directional orientation by convention. Directional orientation by convention we are talking about. So once we understand this basis, you will understand the first perspective which I have said, that you can't call Advaita as a Siddhanta or a Vada. You can't call it as a demonstrated conclusive argument or a kind of a thesis or doctrine that is propounded. It is the transcendent reality which we are talking about. It is that basis which has to be understood to appreciate the whole scheme that is developed and presented to us as Advaita Vedanta. So this is what I wanted to give you about as the second perspective. Now I want to bring another dimension to it about the illusion of space and time, which we now know to be only relative. The theory of relativity has already made it very clear that both space and time are relative and they are not absolute. And also it has been very clearly brought out that one does not exist without the other. And the whole framework of all manifestation in this universe is stated to be spatio-temporal. In fact, that is the reason I think why Einstein was compelled to call time as the fourth dimension, which some people dispute, and there are some other theories about it, but that's not our concern. But what I'm trying to tell you is that the whole of manifestation is within the framework of what we call as the spatio-temporal framework, is within this framework, where both space and time are relative and they do not exist absolutely. Now, coming to the illusion, I want to make a very ordinary, experience of every person. You know that the Earth rotates around its own axis at a speed of 1600 kilometers per hour. The circumference of the Earth is something around 40,000 kilometers. And every hour, it's moving at a speed of 1600 kilometers. But for our consciousness, it appears to be stationary for all practical purposes, isn't it? Something which is rotating at such a high speed, through our normal sensual and mental consciousness, appears to be stationary. That's why I've called it as an illusion. And how do you see time? Is time something visible? Is time something tangible? Is time something subject to modification or interference? Can we shrink or expand time within the field of our consciousness and within the limitation of the earth on which we are living? You really can't do anything about time. You can only perceive it as a movement, that too as a succession of phenomena, as a succession of things happening. You can't really know anything other than that. Suppose an individual is closed in a dark room where no light enters and he can't see any succession of any phenomena. For him, it is as good as the time not being there. So we perceive time through movement as a succession of phenomena. The first thing which we normally come to realize it is the rising of the sun, and then the coming to the meridian or midday or noon, and then slowly setting, then the changing of the seasons, changing of the weather. So these are the only things through which we are able to perceive the movement of time. Can anyone say that time is moving per se? No. What we normally say is it is something that appears to be progressing, of which one is conscious of more internally than externally. We are conscious of this progressing of time internally. Externally, yes, there are phenomena and one can perceive it. But sometimes we can actually internally perceive when we are doing something seriously and we are not aware of how much time has actually passed. But when you come out of that, you feel that, yes, so many hours have passed. I have been in a state of consciousness where time has progressed. So this is what I call it as a classic example of the world we construct on the basis of the inputs we receive from our senses and through the mental faculty, being an illusion. This is a classic example of the world being illusive. When I say illusion, I am not denying the relative reality of it. I am only pointing out that it is not permanent and it is not changeless. I am using the term illusion only in that manner. And just to make things lighter, I'll just show you two pictures to demonstrate how the brain really cannot process things properly. You please have a look at this picture. This, I am told, is called as the Thatcher effect or the Thatcher illusion. This illustrates that the brain cannot properly process a photo or a face that's upside down. The brain cannot process that. The interesting part is that the brain thinks it can. So you get a confident feeling that everything is all right until you turn it over. Now, you really cannot process a picture which is upside down and looks like this. Now, I'll reveal the truth of this matter when you turn it over upside down. Look at this picture now. Was the brain able to process this when it was looking at it upside down? This is an interesting example of how the brain is conditioned and the brain is its operations are very limited and how it cannot really process a photograph when it is upside down. Look at the beauty of this illusion. And look at also the limitation of the brain or the mental faculty to process it properly when it is actually in the right manner. Here it is upside down and therefore you're looking at it from a totally different dimension or a different perception is there. Now, when I have actually turned out, it turns out to be this. So isn't it a very beautiful illusion to tell you how the very functioning of the brain is limited? So operating in limitation, I would call that as illusion. I would call that as illusion when it is unable to process properly because of its own perceptive limitations. So this is what is to be understood very clearly when I'm talking about what an illusion is, similar to the example which I have given earlier of what is actually moving at a tremendous speed of 1600 kilometers per hour appears to be stationary, and what is actually not tangible or cannot be grasped properly appears to be progressing and moving. So time, an intangible thing, appears to be progressing, and the earth, which is something very concrete and tangible, when it is moving at a tremendous speed, it's not able to realize it. Obviously, the reason for the explanation for it is that everything around it is stationary, and relative to that, the movement doesn't appear. So if you go out of this earth, beyond the gravitational force of this earth, then you will be able to see the earth actually rotating at that tremendous speed. Normally, it is said that when you are in a spacecraft outside the gravitational this thing, and you are observing the earth, you get almost about 16 sunrises and 16 sunsets, depending on the speed at which the spacecraft is moving. So you see that as long as you are in it, you are bound by illusion, by limitation, by what the literature calls it as ignorance. The term used is avidya. So look at it from that perspective, and the understanding of this is much more important to appreciate Advaita Vedanta. Now, another interesting perspective which I want to present is that the Indic perspective starts with the examination of the infinite. Once the great seers and sages of the Upanishadic time came to a general understanding that all our faculties are limited and distorted and constricted by their very own nature, in the sense that our eyes have a certain range of vision. There are so many other birds and animals which can see much better than a human being can. And there are so many other animals and birds which can hear beyond the range of human hearing. Like, for example, dogs. So the Vedic seers and sages, when they came to the conclusion that all we see around us everything that is tangible and cognizable by the senses and faculties which we have is by its very nature limited, by its very built, the way they are made is limited. Then they said, we see this impermanence, we see this change, we see this constant movement, and nothing is really graspable as such. That means they were therefore compelled to look at something which is permanent, which is changeless, which is immutable, which is beyond the dimensions of time and space. And that they have termed it as infinite or infinity. And therefore the term anantam is used. So look at the Indic perspective. Having understood the significance and the definition of unity, they have also given another dimension to it and said that this, what we are identifying as unity without a second, ekameva advitiyam, is not one from the transcendental dimension. It may be one in manifestation, but from the transcendental dimension, that unity is also infinity. So they said, we need to examine it from that perspective. So when Advaita talks about infinity, it is a logical derivative of the thinking process of the sages and seers of the Upanishads, where they have said that yes, in manifestation, you have one, and the one has become manifold. But however manifold it may be, it is still limited, it is still finite, and therefore, in order to grasp the reality of this whole system, we need to go out of the system and see this. As I said, in order to perceive the movement and the speed at which the earth is rotating, you need to go outside the gravitational field of the earth and then perceive the earth. So a similar analogy can be given here when they said that as long as you are stuck in this limitation of one and manifold manifestation of things, you cannot really perceive the truth of it. You cannot really understand what exactly it is. And therefore, you have to take a quantum leap out of this known into the unknown, which we have called it as infinity. So the emphasis has always been not on things. Even in the what is called as the mundane world, or the world with which we are familiar, the world of concrete things, they have identified and said that the emphasis cannot be on things per se. The emphasis can never be on individual items because there is no ending to it. You keep on coming to it again and again and again. So the emphasis was always on relationships, connectedness, and context. This is what I have noted here, that Fritjof Capra, the author of the famous book, The Tao of Physics, which is almost 45 years old, he calls this as systems thinking. As I mentioned, within the system, also the emphasis should not be on individual items and individual things as discrete and concrete items as such, but the emphasis should always be on relationships, connectedness, and context. So the shifting of focus has been from objects to relationships, from objective knowledge to contextual knowledge. How far is this useful for me? This knowledge is useful for me to understand and examine infinity. That's why they discarded everything. They simply discarded everything. No, Understanding about objective science and objective things has no relevance to my examination of the what is infinite, because this is very much contextual and very much operating in a closed loop. Therefore, the emphasis has been from quantity to quality, from structure to process, and from contents to patterns. This was the shift in the entire thinking, because they wanted to examine the infinity, what is beyond this finite manifestation of things. So that is the perspective which we need to get, and reason for examining infinity first. They have actually started with the known, but they have understood the limitations of the known, and therefore proposed that there should be an entity which is beyond the knowable and beyond the known. So that was the proposition, and that's how infinity came into picture, and the examination of that infinity through a different set of faculties, a different mechanism, a totally different mechanism to understand or come into direct contact with it, come into what is called as pratyaksha. Pratyaksha means direct and immediate. That means there is no mediation, there is no element of mediation between things. You see, whatever we see in this world, there is a mediation. We understand something because there is an observer and an observed separately, and there is a process of observation connecting these two. And therefore, the observer can acquire some tangible knowledge of the observed. But that cannot happen with the infinity, because the examiner himself is being examined now. The observer himself is the object of observation. So it is all a matter of subjectivity. It is all a matter of going inwards. The direction also is now changed now. Because how do I understand this whole thing? So there is this inward movement. So that is the shifting of the focus. And that's where we have come to when we are emphasizing on the shift of this focus. Therefore, as I said, the third perspective which I'm talking about is examining the infinity, having understood the finite. So you have the infinity, unless you realize it, is still only a proposition. But the beauty of infinity as compared to anything finite is also indicated in the Upanishads very clearly, where it says, Brahmavid Brahmaiva Bhavati. The knower of the truth himself becomes the truth. See, for example, if I gather some knowledge about physics or mathematics, I don't become physics or mathematics by that way, isn't it? But when you are moving in the inward direction and examining the very observer, the very examiner, they said a point comes where the knower himself becomes the known. So the observer becomes the observed. And there is only pure observation and nothing else. That is the reality where the irrelevance of observer comes into play. If the observer is relevant, then you are still operating in the field of the finite only. You are not operating beyond it. Only when the observer is totally irrelevant to the process and you become pure observation, you come into touch, into contact with that reality, that ultimate reality. That is the beauty of the whole Indic perspective. And we'll come to the fourth perspective, which will elaborate on this, which says that the Western perspective of reality is that which can be measured. This has been stated in so many words by scientists and philosophers like Descartes and others. who have simply said what cannot be measured does not exist. But the Indic perspective is diametrically opposite. The Advaitic perspective is diametrically opposite to this, and they said what can be measured is an illusion, and what cannot be measured is the only reality. This is the beauty of it. Whatever can be measured, they said it's an illusion because it is operating within the field of the finite. Only what cannot be measured is the true reality. In fact, the word Maya comes from the root ma, to measure. Ma in Sanskrit means to measure. And that is the root word for the term called Maya or illusion. Maya is posited, therefore, as the source of the visible universe. The whole visible universe is pervaded by Maya, by measurement, which is an illusion, which is a limited, functional, self-enclosed aspect as against the reality which is immeasurable, which cannot be measured. The one-sided dependence and the logical inconceivability of the relation between the ultimate reality and the world are brought out by the word Maya. Here I am quoting Radhakrishnan from his introduction to the Bhagavad Gita. He makes a very pertinent point and says the one-sided dependence and the logical inconceivability of the relation between the ultimate reality and the world are brought out by the word Maya. The world is not essential being like Brahman, nor is it non-being. It cannot be defined as either being or non-being. Sadasadbhyam anirvachaniyam is the term used. It is neither sat nor asat. It cannot be classified as one of the two. That is the Maya. See, he calls it as one-sided because the ultimate reality can, in some mysterious way, be in contact with the world, but the other way around of the world somehow coming into contact with the ultimate reality while it is functioning within this limitation is not possible at all. So that is the meaning of one-sided dependence. And he goes on to add that Maya does not imply that the world is an illusion or is non-existent absolutely. It is a delimitation distinct from the unmeasured and the immeasurable. It has limited itself. Now, he goes on to add one very important factor which we need to understand. And he says, but why is there this delimitation? The logical question is, why is there this delimitation? Then he himself answers and says, this question cannot be answered so long as we are at the empirical level. So long as you are within the system, you cannot comprehensively understand the system. So this question becomes irrelevant. It acquires relevance only when you are able to operate outside the system, go beyond the system, go beyond the limitation. So that is the beauty of this. And therefore, the measurability and the immeasurability come into play with the term that is used traditionally as Maya. A lot of condemnation has been done by subsequent schools of thought about this Mayavada. But that, according to me, is a misconception and a misunderstanding of the whole concept of Maya. Very symbolically, when I was doing some study on this Maya, I came across this. Symbolically, Maya in our scriptures is depicted as the daughter of Anruta and Nirruti. Anruta means falsehood, that which is not true. Anruta is called as the father. The first term, Anruta, means falsehood, and it is shown as the father of Maya. And the second term is said to be a personification as the goddess of death and corruption. Nirruti is a personification of a goddess of death and corruption. And Nirruti also means dissolve, decay, debilitate. So death and corruption is the mother. Falsehood is the father of Maya. And see further beauty of the tradition. The tradition also mentions Maya as the daughter of Adharma and as the mother of Bhaya. As long as you are operating within this system, there is the great probability of Adharma coming into play. This Adharma, in one way, if somebody is familiar with thermodynamics, is the law of entropy. The law of entropy says the entropy of the universe is ever increasing, which means that the disintegration factor, which is symbolized by the term entropy, the disintegrating factor is ever increasing. Disintegrating factors is dharma, is adharma. Because the meaning of dharma is that which is upheld, that which is sustained, that which is nourished. So the direction of dharma is upwards, is elevating. And the very meaning is given as dharyate anena iti dharmaha. That which is upheld, that which is born, that which is held up. So the holding up of dharma is possible only when you understand reality. Otherwise, we are bound to fall into what is called as adharma. And the biggest factor, psychology throughout the world have also accepted that the biggest driving force is fear. Fear of uncertainty. Fear of managing change. Fear of losing things. So we operate in fear. But fear is the key. Fear is the basis for all operation. And see the symbolism. Maya as the daughter of Adharma and the mother of Bhaya. Maya gives birth to Bhaya. Maya, having come into being, gives birth to Adharma as its daughter, as her daughter. So this very interesting symbolism that is presented in the scriptures and in the explanation of this term Maya, I thought is something which I should share with you. So this is the factor which we are talking about. Now, for the purpose of intellectual understanding and conceptualization of the term Brahman, that which is beyond words and expressions, statements are made whose profundity is to be fathomed through contemplation, meditation, and realization. Now we have seen what is limitation. We have seen what is ignorance. We have seen what is Maya. Now, how do we move to the other dimension? So to begin with, we need to have an intellectual understanding and conceptualize it, and therefore it needs symbols. And that symbol is what we call as Brahman. The word Brahman is not Brahman. Brahman is beyond words and expressions. So why do we need this, make these statements? Because we need to primarily and initially have an intellectual understanding and concept of it, and therefore it is used. But what is to be done? To understand the profundity of such a statement, we need contemplation, meditation, and realization. That's what the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, Yajnavalkya very beautifully says, Drashtavyaha, Shrotavyaha, Mantavyaha, Nididhyasitavyaha. You need to see, you need to hear, you need to contemplate, you need to meditate upon it, and then you will come to the realization of it. Otherwise, it's not possible. One such statement I have marked here is Satyam, Jnanam, Anantam, Brahma. I'll be discussing this subsequently, maybe tomorrow, with a greater emphasis on this term. But this is a statement where the term Brahman is defined as Satyam, Jnanam, and Anantam. As something truth, something which is consciousness and which is awareness, and something which is infinite. You can't grapple with this profound statement through words and expressions and discussion and argument. One needs to hold this in one's consciousness to have a deeper understanding of it. So such profound statements are made whose meaning can be fathomed only through contemplation, meditation, and realization. That is the reason why the emphasis on going beyond the mind. Going beyond the mind. Now, therefore, we come to this perspective on mind. Now, mind, or what is called as manas in the Vedantic principles that are explained, is only one part of what is called as the antahkarana, or the inner instrument or organ of consciousness or perception. This antahkarana is composed of manas, buddhi, ahankara, and chitta. I'll also dwell upon this when I talk about it in more elaboration, possibly tomorrow. So manas is only a small part, and it is closely associated with the sense organs. And that's why Adi Shankaracharya calls it as the sixth sense or the sixth organ. And what is the importance of this mind? You have to use the mind to transcend the mind. I am very, very much, I have been quoting this example for a long, long time, and I'm very fond of this example of pole vaulting. Pole vaulting, if you visualize it, you will see that a person is using a long pole to reach a certain height and jump beyond a point, beyond a bar. Now, the comparison which I normally make is that this mind is like the pole. The pole, which is the most useful instrument in order to take that athlete to that height. Once having reached the height, it becomes the biggest hurdle which he has to drop and then jump onto the other side. Have we ever seen a person doing pole vaulting jumping onto the other side along with the pole? It will be literally impossible. You can't hold on to the pole if you want to jump onto the other side. So similarly, Vedanta, Advaita Vedanta has emphasized the usefulness of the mind only to a certain level, where it is a very useful instrument and it has to be very sharp and acute and has to be developed to a great level of skill. But having reached the threshold, you have to drop the mind in order to transcend the mind. So this example of pole vaulting very graphically illustrates, if you connect it by understanding that the pole and the mind are having this close association. The pole is nothing but the mind. In our case, when we want to go on to the other side and jump into what is being called as the transcendental aspect of it, beyond the mind. And therefore, the Amrita Bindu Upanishad has a beautiful mantra, which is again a very famous mantra, which says, Manayeva Manushyanam Karanam Bandhamokshayo, Bandhaya Vishayasaktam Muktam Nirvishayam Sputam. As long as you are attached to the objective world, you are bound. The moment you drop the objective world, you are free. And mind is the cause for both. Mind is the cause, the karana for bandha and moksha, both for bondage and liberation. The mind is the cause. This is precisely the reason why the transcendence of the mind becomes an essential part of the whole scheme of things. The whole scheme of things point out to this, which if you are not familiar with the whole system, may appear to be ridiculous. So therefore, lot of other philosophies or schools of thought and psychologists and civilizational perspectives on this have objected to this, and said, how can I jump out of myself? Because it is the me, it is the I, it is what is mine. That defines the I. So how do I jump out of myself? It's a very interesting question. But the answer is given in Advaita Vedanta this way. Once you see the limitation of the senses and the other faculties, once you see the limitation of the mind and the illusory nature of the mind, then obviously you have no other choice but to transcend the mind. But a dull mind, a lazy mind, a mind which is not sharp and acute cannot do this. That's why the whole exercise is compared to walking on the razor's edge. Kshurasya dhara nishita duratyaya. The Kathopanishad brings out this fact very beautifully and says it is like walking on the edge of a razor. You walk on it, your feet are cut. If you try to balance on that, it's not possible because it's very thin and you are liable to fall either this way or that way. So it is so keen and sharp and something which is appears to be wrought with danger. But that's the only way. That's the only way one can come to it. One cannot go beyond that. Okay, then we come to another perspective. And here I just wanted to clarify one more aspect of it. When I'm talking about the manas, the Indic perspective is not on only manas, but they have made it much more comprehensive and called it as chitta. The Patanjali Yoga Sutras, the very beginning, the second sutra itself says, what is yoga? The definition of yoga, both as a goal and as a process, defines it as yogas chitta vritti nirodha. They did not use the term manas, they have used the term chitta, which flows from what is called as chit, which is one of the aspects of the triplicity, which is called as sat, chit and ananda. I'll come to these triplicities and other things tomorrow, because that is one of the subjects which I have indicated. But to very briefly, it is important to understand what this chit means. Now, chit is one of the three aspects of the ultimate reality in manifestation. It is this aspect which is at the basis of the form side of the universe through which it is created. So chit is the basis which brings into existence all the form side of the universe in the creative process. The reflection of this aspect in the individual soul, which is a microcosm of that Brahman, which is otherwise called as Atman, the reflection of this chit in this microcosm is what is called as chitta. So chitta is thus that instrument or medium through which the Jivatma materializes his individual world, lives and evolves in the world until he has become perfected and united with the Paramatma. I'm not going to define these terms Jivatma and Paramatma. I assume that one has a reasonable understanding of it. But to give it more, a detailed understanding of it, we can discuss it at a later stage. But this is the one side is the Brahman and the other side is Atman, or what is being a different nomenclature that is used is calling it as Jivatma and Paramatma. And this Chitta is a medium. And as it evolves, as it becomes more and more perfect, this Jivatma unites with the Paramatma. while chitta may be considered as a universal medium through which consciousness functions on all the planes of the manifested universe, the mind of modern psychology is confined to the expression of only thought, volition, and feeling. This is how modern psychology defines mind. Whereas the Indic perspective, the Vedantic perspective about chitta is that it is a universal medium through which consciousness functions on all planes of existence. So that is the chitta part of it. It is fundamentally of the nature of consciousness, which is immaterial but affected by matter. Chitta per se is immaterial but is affected by matter. In fact, it may be called as a product of both consciousness and matter, or what are called in the Sankhya philosophy as Purusha and Prakriti, the presence of both being necessary for its function. I have taken this aspect of explaining to you about chitta from the book called The Science of Yoga, written by Professor I.K. Taimni. You can refer to that and you will have a greater elaboration on this, because this is what he brings out when he talks about the sutra Yogas Chitta Vritti Nirodha. So this is the dimension. Then we'll go to the sixth dimension or sixth perspective. As I said, when you're talking about the infinite or the infinity, the Advaitic inquiry starts with that which is infinite, immeasurable, and imperishable. And that is what is mentioned in the seventh mantra of the Mandukya Upanishad. Adrushtam, Avyavaharyam, Agrahyam, Alakshanam, Achintyam, Avyapadeshyam. All negative terms are used because no positive term can define it. It is something which is beyond perception, not conceivable. It does not engage in any kind of transaction. Avyavaharyam. Agrahyam, you cannot grasp it. Alakshanam, it has no attributes. Achintyam is inconceivable by thought. And finally, Avyapadeshyam, it cannot be communicated. And he goes on to define further and say, Ekatma Pratyayasaram, Prapanchopashamam, Shantam, Shivam, Advaitam, Sa Atma Savigneyaha. I'll not go into the details of it. That is what he says. It is the essence of that unity. Ekatma Pratyayasaram. Prapanchopashamam. The whole creation ceases to have any relevance. It is completely pacified. It is completely nullified in one sense and loses its relevance. Prapancho, Shantam. These are defined to only give us a mental understanding or an intellectual appreciation of it. It is peace. It is auspiciousness. Shantam, Shivam, Advaitam, non-dual. That is the Atma, and that is what is to be known. The Upanishads have very clearly not made any distinction between the Brahman and the Atman, except from a functional point of view. So when we say infinite, when we say immeasurable, imperishable, the infinite is posited as that which is whole, complete, and the totality of it. It's not void. It's not shunya. For us, it is purnam. This purnam is the concept of infinity. Purnamadav purnamidam. Purnat purnamudachyate. Purnasya purnamadaya purnamevavashishyate. That is infinity, this is infinity. And infinity comes out of infinity. Purnasya purnamada, purnat purnamudachyate. And you subtract infinity from infinity, what remains is still infinity. So they did not use the term Ananta here. Ananta has a more manifestation dimension to it. When you use the term Purnam, it is the transcendental and the unmanifest aspect of it. Purnam. And when I was doing this study, I came across this very interesting perception about this mathematical symbol of infinity. Do you see that the mathematical symbol of infinity is two conjoined zeros? One zero beside the other. They are conjoined zeros. So 1 0 is the absence of something. 2 zeros, when they are conjoined, is infinity. An interesting perception of the symbol might not have just randomly evolved. At least to my understanding, I think that this mathematical symbol of infinity did not randomly evolve and somebody suddenly decided to turn number 8 horizontally. No. I would see rather as two conjoined zeros. So this is the perspective of wholeness, totality, something which is complete in itself, which has nothing to lack, nothing wanting is there, nothing which can bring about a further totality to it or further completeness to it. It is complete in itself and totality in itself, and therefore it is symbolized by the Shukla Yajurveda Shanti mantra of Purnamada Purnamidam. Then we'll go to the next perspective. Perspective number 7. I will take another 15 minutes time allotted to me to take you through another 2 or 3 perspectives which I have. The Vedic perspective and the Vedic and the Advaitic perspective identified the primordial, fundamental and root element of all manifestation as Akasha. At least to my knowledge and my understanding, no other culture or civilization has talked about this Akasha. All other cultures, civilizations, philosophies have dealt with only 4 elements: air, fire, water, and earth. Nowhere Akasha comes into the picture. But the Advaitic perspective starts with Akasha. It says everything begins with Akasha. Akashat Vayurajayata, Vayoragnihi. From Akasha comes Vayu, from Vayu comes Agni, from Agni comes water, from Apas comes Prithvi. So Akasha is the fundamental and root element of all manifestation. And there is something beautiful about Akasha. Akasha is considered as the medium for consciousness and transmission of all forms of energy. And therefore, we also talk about the unmanifest sound, Nada Brahman. It is Nada. It is something which cannot be heard. What can be heard is the Shabda only, which requires air. Nada doesn't require air. Nada is independent and operates in Akasha. When it comes into contact and air comes into being, then the Nada becomes a Shabda. And Akasha, if you see, is uniform. Every unit of Akasha, if you are able to visualize it as 1 cubic centimeter or something, every unit of Akasha is uniform. It is isotropic. And it is totally unfathomable. Why? Nothing material can ever touch it. I'm not going into these examples given in the Bhagavad Gita in chapter 9, verse 6 and chapter 13, 16. In chapters 9, 6, the verse itself talks about Akasha. And in 13, 16, Adi Shankara gives in his commentary and uses the term Vyoma. Vyomavat. I'll not go into those details, but what I'm trying to say is the beauty of Akasha, if you perceive it, nothing material can touch Akasha. And at the same time, Everything is within Akasha. Whether you take the Earth or the other planets or the whole planetary system or even the galaxies and other planetary systems or the stars or anything for that matter is within Akasha. And can we say that it touches Akasha? Anything touches Akasha? You see the beauty of this tattva? Akasha as a tattva is a very interesting subject for our study. It also denotes the very nature of that ultimate reality. Everything is within the ultimate reality, immanent in it, but nothing can really touch it. Nothing can absolutely come into contact with this Akasha. And he calls, the Bhagavad Gita calls it as Nityam. It is that eternal Akasha through which air pervades everywhere. So this is another very interesting element, or as I said, perspective in Advaita. Then we'll go to the 8th perspective. A very interesting perspective that comes about is that very frequently a question is asked as to why there is evil in manifestation. Generally, some kind of foolish arguments are extended. If God is there in everything and everybody, then evil should not be there. There is an interesting joke about it. When a philosopher was discussing with a barber on this subject, then the barber countered this question and said, "Sir, if that is the case, there should not be any person in this world with long hair." Then the philosopher said, "What do you mean by it? Because the barber is there, no? I am there. So no, there should not be anybody with flowing hair or long hair or messy hair in this world." The point to be made is the barber cannot go to everybody and cut their hair. The person has to come to the barber for trimming and cutting of the hair. So see, the whole point is that evil is the wrong term actually. It is what is called as ignorance or avidya, or the non-recognition of the presence of an unchanging principle, even though we identify ourselves also as the I. This I has been the same I since my birth. Has this I really changed? No. The I has actually in one way grown in size and accumulation of experiences, knowledge, memory, and all other factors related to it. And it has actually expanded. But I remain the same. I am the same person who I was when I was born, and continue to be the same over several decades. Till my death, I'll continue to be identifying myself with this I, which is a demonstration of an unchanging principle operating in me. So, the presence of evil or the defiance of the law of nature and acting against nature and civil behavior is on account of ignorance or what is called as avidya, or non-recognition of the presence of an unchanging principle. Radhakrishnan very beautifully says that ignorance is not an intellectual error. It is spiritual blindness. As a self-conscious being, man is actually aware of the deeper discords in him. He generally resorts to working compromises and leads a precarious life. That's how evil comes into being. We are always resorting to working out the compromises and leading a very precarious life, thinking that this entity is separate from all other entities. This entity, which I call as my or me or I, assumes a kind of false independence and therefore brings into conflict. So there is only one primary division from the mental point of view, or this identification of I, which says the me and the not me. That's all. It is the me, and everything else other than me is the not me. So it is always in conflict. The me and the not me are will always be in conflict until you recognize that this discord, this conflict is a result of ignorance. That is how evil comes into being. And there is a very interesting Yoga Sutra which defines avidya. He says, Anitya, Ashuchi, Dukkha, Anatmasu, Nitya, Shuchi, Sukha, Atma Khyati Avidya. So what is impermanent? What is impure? What is evil? And what is not the self thinks that it is permanent, thinks that it is pure, thinks that it is good, and thinks that itself to be Atma. This I, this is the I. The I is Anitya because it is something which is an accumulation over a period of time. When you are operating with this within the spatio-temporal framework, you are bound to acquire this identity within this space and time. So it is impermanent. And essentially, any division is polluting the whole system. And therefore, it is called as impure. And dukkha does not necessarily mean suffering. The suffering is a consequence of what we call as evil, or what we call it as this divisive nature in us. The loss of that excellence, that beauty. And it is not the true self. Therefore, he calls it as Anatman. So look at this. What is impermanent? The I thinks it is permanent. What is polluting? It thinks it is pure. What is evil? It considers it is a good because the good is personal now. And what is not the true self? It considers that the true self. And that Patanjali in the Yoga Sutras defines it as avidya. Now this very clearly tells us how evil comes into being. And I'm not very comfortable by using the term evil. I would rather use the term limitation and lack of awareness. I'm using the term evil to explain the general perception as to why there is this evil at all in this manifested world. It is not evil. It is actually what we call as ignorance and operating in limitation. And somebody has very beautifully put it in another way. It is like the dark bands on a spectrum of light. Any light, some knowledge of physics will tell you that any light, you can create a spectrum of that light. And all the things are not reflected. Any light for that matter, any physical light cannot entirely illumine the entire spectrum. There are bands and bands and bands. Starting from the infrared to the ultraviolet, there are bands in it. So evil is like the absence of light. Evil is darkness or the absence of light, and they are the bands in a spectrum. So if your light is total and pure, there won't be any bands at all. There won't be any dark bands in the spectrum. So that appears to be a very beautiful comparison to say that it is the absence of development, absence of manifestation, absence of evolution to a level where the whole spectrum is illuminated. So that is where it is a proper place is created for this. Then I would like to go into one more aspect of it. The divine presence does not assert itself unless the individual comes to recognize it through his own journey of self-discovery. This is the barber's example again. The divine presence does not assert itself and come to you and tells you that I am the divine presence, please accept me, please recognize me, and so on. One has to go through one's own journey of self-discovery. We neither perceive this presence in us nor in everything around us, where it persistently reveals itself in nature and in all living beings. If we are sensitive enough, we see the divine presence in everything, like a beautiful blooming flower, like a beautiful bird, or a beautiful cloud, or a snow-capped hilltop, a mountain top. It reveals itself in so many ways, in so many living creatures and nature per se, but we don't perceive it. And that is the reason why in the 7th chapter, verse number 12, Sri Krishna brings this very subtle aspect into focus. And he says, I am not in them, but they are in me. This is paradoxical. He says, I am not in them, but they are in me. Natvaham teshu te mai. The idea is, unless you recognize the divine presence, how can one claim that that divine presence is in me? First of all, I have to recognize the divine presence in me to claim that presence of it. But the transcendent reality, the ultimate reality in manifestation, is all inclusive. So evil and everything else is also included in it, but evil remains evil as long as it does not recognize this divine presence. The moment it recognizes the divine presence, it's no longer there. So this foolish and adamantine behavior in us leads to denial of that presence and thus paves the way to act in a manner contrary to the eternal laws of spiritual evolution. This is the dharma. So we deliberately suppress it as it is very inconvenient and it challenges our very being, so carefully built up over our lives. I don't want to let go of this I. I don't want to lose this identity. Any thought of that, I feel very inconvenient. And it is challenging the very existence of me. This is what Patanjali calls as the last klesha of Abhinivesha. I'll not go much into it, but a study of that will reveal this fact. Clinging on to the known, holding on to what I know. I am comfortable with this knowledge of I, me, mine, and all the paraphernalia which I have created around me. So I hold on to it. This is where this the whole issue of sorrow, suffering, evil, conflict, everything come into manifestation. And the more the people are involved in it, the more you perceive the manifestation of this evil. But essentially, there is a divine law which says that evil per se is self-limiting. Nobody can do unlimited damage. There are forces to curb that, but nobody can prevent you from doing unlimited good. You can do unlimited good, but you cannot do unlimited damage. That is where the avatara comes into play. If you see the allegory of Hiranyaksha, he was literally folding the whole earth like a mat. Then the avatara comes into play and prevents it from doing it. So there is a self-limiting aspect of evil. That is the divine law in operation. That is what is called as Rutam also. There's a dynamic cosmic order which will outbalance all disorders and all imbalances and take it to a higher level of equilibrium. So this is what is to be recognized. This is what is important for us to understand. And I come to the last perspective for today's discussion is true jnana and the true role of jnana. What do you consider as true jnana? I am not using the translations of jnana, the translation of the word jnana, kshetra and kshetrajna deliberately, because jnana is loosely translated as knowledge or wisdom or something else. Jnana per se is, I would rather use the term awareness, a kind of a universal awareness and a complete alertness in that vision, where you perceive that unity of it. Now, Adi Shankara, the propounder and expounder of Advaita, makes two definitive statements in his commentary on the two most important verses of the Bhagavad Gita. The three most important verses in the whole of Bhagavad Gita, where Adi Shankara establishes the truth of Advaita, is the 11th verse in 2nd chapter, the 2nd verse in the 13th chapter, and the 66th verse in the 18th chapter. Here he says, Kshetrajnam chapimam vidhi, sarva kshetriyeshu bharata, kshetra kshetrajnayor jnanam, yad jnanam matam mama. The kshetrajna, the knower of the field, the one who has the awareness and totality of that field of operation, is the kshetrajna, who is in all kshetras, who is in all fields of manifestation, and who is differentiated by the manifold upadhis, manifold instruments and instrumentality of the whole system, like your jnanendriyas, karmendriyas, your manas and the antahkarana and all that, they're all upadhis and a part of the kshetra. Right from the Brahma, the creator, to a clump of grass, he says this is what is pervaded by it. But really devoid, the kshetrajna is really devoid of all the various conditions or adjuncts and is inaccessible to any such word or thought or expression as sat or asat, being or non-being. Not aware of it. The sat and asat are also within the relative field only. So that is the nature of the kshetrajna. And he who knows both these aspects of kshetrajna and kshetra, that jnana is the true jnana, he says. That jnana is the true jnana, as nothing else remains to be known apart from the truth of kshetra, kshetrajna and Ishvara. That jnana of the kshetra and kshetrajna is considered by me to be the right knowledge. Tat jnanam samyak jnanam, he says. That's what it is. So this perspective has to be very clearly there. Unless you know the totality of it, you can't really call it as jnana. Similarly, in the 66th verse, which is sometimes is a very famous verse, and it is called as the Charma Shloka, almost the final verdict or the final verse of Sri Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita. Sarvadharman parityajya mamekam sharanam braja, aham tva sarvapapebhyo mokshayishyami mashucha. Moksha, or what is called as emancipation or nishreyasa, liberation or emancipation, is not an end product. It is beyond the realm of cause and effect. Adi Shankara very clearly says that neither karma nor jnana produce an entity which is eternal. This is the true role of jnana. He said the true role of jnana is only to remove ajnana, nothing beyond that. That is the only role. And therefore, he very clearly establishes and says, neither through action nor through the path of knowledge can you come to this. You can only remove the ignorance part of it, and you will then only the whole system, the whole of the jnana or the truth of that ultimate reality will be revealed to you. I think I have exceeded by about 5 or 6 minutes. Sorry for the exceeding. I see some questions. I'll just stop sharing this now. And Nitinji.
Namaste, Krishna Pandiji.
I
It was a
hand over.
wonderful session. We still have time. We have still 9 minutes to go. Viewers, if you have any questions, now is the time to place them. Krishna Pandiji, as I was listening to your wonderful lecture, especially you explaining about 1 and 0 and how 1 represents Brahman and Ekam Eva Dvitiyam. It reminded me when I wrote in my first book back in 2016, there was a chapter I included on infinity and zero, where I argued that the infinity represents Brahman and the zero represents Maya. So it is my understanding that when it says Ekam Eva Advitiyam, the Advitiyam part actually is used to denote that the Ekam is not a numerical one, but it is
Yes.
refers to infinity. So
Right.
what do you, what is your...
What you are saying is absolutely correct. That's what I mentioned also. See, zero, you can rightly equate it to Maya in one respect, that it is, it does not have any, as I said, a validity of its own. It doesn't have a validity of its own. And this Ekam, as you rightly said, is not one. It is only unity in the sense, only that is there and nothing else is there. That is the reason why the emphasis on Advitiyam comes. If it were to simply called as Ekam, it would sound like the number 1. So therefore they added the term Advitiyam to establish that there cannot be a second to it. It is that Purnam, it is that total, and truly it represents infinity. So your understanding is perfectly correct. I was trying to give a dimension to it to just show as a perspective, and my emphasis was more on the fact that unity is the basis of it and not zero. The ground of Advaita is unity, which is one and infinity. Unlike what others, maybe philosophies talk about, shunya or void. So that's the reason why I said Advaita very logically and argues very specifically to say that you can't call it as void. You call it as Purnam. Shunya has no place in it. And maybe Nagarjuna in Buddhism might have used this term Shunya to denote from a physical point of view. In the sense, if you ask what is there, there is nothing which is known to you. Nothing which is known to you as you want to understand here. And therefore the term Shunya might have been used, because see, you can't discount Nagarjuna and argue on his expression just because we don't know his experience. The expression is not important. The whole concept behind it is to say that it is the unknown. It is the unknowable from our perspective. You are all your senses and your mind, and nothing is going to work there. Therefore, it is as good as calling it as nothing.
Wonderful, wonderful. One of the questions that we often get on our programs is, how do we retain this conviction or this understanding of Advaita on a day-to-day basis, especially when we are doing this Shravana for 1 hour, 2 hours, we become convinced with this, Brahmo Satyam Jagan Mityam Jiva Brahmaiva Naparaha. But when we go back to our day-to-day life, that knowledge or that understanding is no longer there. We become affected by the sorrow, we become affected by the day-to-day tensions and happenings. So what is your any tips or any advice on this?
That is where the sadhana chatushtaya comes. That is where one has to exercise viveka constantly. In every action, every thought, every word, every deed, one has to constantly exercise the discrimination, or what is called as viveka, nitya nitya vastu viveka. So once you exercise it, in fact, life becomes a great joy. Life becomes like a play. You are automatically detached from it because you know that this is going to end. After 3 hours, the movie is going to end. After 30, 40, 50, 60, 100 years, the movie is going to end. So what is it that you are holding on to? What is it that is attracting you, and what is it that is causing this bondage, this binding? Is because you are unable to discriminate between what is eternal and what is ephemeral. Knowing very well the fact is that everything is ephemeral. See, in some other context, when I was talking about it, the pandemic has actually made this very clear. At least we have seen that for every person, there would be, in the whole of the world, there would not be an exception, except maybe somewhere, and there may be some countries who are not at all affected by it, but every person might have lost a relation, close relation, or a friend, or a colleague, or an acquaintance, or somebody or the other. And that strikes us about the very ephemeral nature of things. And to tell you the truth, it was so unfortunate that somebody very close to us passed away, and we couldn't go and see him or see his body also. Because they refused to give the body, they refused to allow people to gather. So a person who was there till yesterday is suddenly no more, and you can't even actually bring a closure to your mind by seeing his body. So you see the constant exercise of viveka is that is why as called as the first element of the practice of sadhana chatushtaya, because this viveka is what is going to bring about vairagya. So you are detached from all this game play that is going on. You are a mere spectator. Coming to the Upanishadic statement, Sakshi Cheta Kevalo Nirgunascha. You become a Sakshi. And it is not something one cannot practice. One can truly practice it. One can truly come to it. This practice.
Mhm.
It's not something which is very difficult. You can see through the whole thing. Once you have that vision, you can see through the whole game.
Thank you, sir, for that clarification. It was again, I would like to thank on behalf of all Advaita Academy for such a engaging and insightful session. Now we are almost out of time, so
Yes.
viewers, we come to conclusion of today's session. But Krishna Paniji will continue his insightful discussion tomorrow, same time, 5 to 7. Do join us. If you have any questions that could not be answered today, you have a chance tomorrow also to ask those questions. With this, we conclude the session. Shri Gurubhyo Namaha.
Thank you so much. Thank you.